thanks for coming to attend this this little briefing about the Export-Import Bank, an agency, an over 80-year-old agency that I'm sure many of you had never heard of until last year or even this year, right? How many of you actually knew of ExIm before last year? Oh, a fair amount, but still. So why should we care about the Export-Import Bank? Well, the first reason, obviously, is because a lot of people care right now, and also because the bank's charter is going to expire. It was set to expire in September, and now it's set to expire in June. So that's the reason why there's a lot of action going on. But what is different about this time around, right, is it used to be kind of a piece of cake. I mean, ExIm charter would be extended without voice call. It was just like, there wasn't even really a vote. It was just like, it was something that was taken for granted, but now things are different. And one of the main reasons is because there's been a cultural shift in the kind of things that we care about and how sensitive the American people, and hence Congress, is to the issue of cronyism. And I'll say that I think ExIm, even though an agency with a pretty small footprint and relative to the, in the grand scheme of things, it actually is one of the poster childs for cronyism. So why is this? And I should say that even though it has a pretty small footprint, I mean, we still are, with all of these programs, there's a pretty big taxpayer exposure in the end of the day. It may be that every year, the bank only adds how much it guarantees just by small amount. The cumulative amount remains pretty big. So, as I said, the ExIm Bank is one of the worst example of what we call cronyism, this unhealthy marriage between the private sector and the government. And I want to show you why. So first, it's customer, right? Who are like the beneficiaries? Who benefit from the ExIm Bank? We call it Boeing Bank, but one of the overlooked aspects of the beneficiaries of ExIm are the foreign buyers, the people who are actually getting the cheap loans, right? Who are getting very good terms abroad in order to buy US goods and services. So who are they? So in this table, as you can see, we put the top 10 beneficiaries of ExIm in the last 8 years, right? And as you can see, like just to give you a rough overrun of this list, 5 are airlines, and 5 companies are oil and gas company. The top beneficiaries over the last 8 years has been Pemex. Pemex is a state-owned Mexican oil and gas company with a market cap of $416 million, right? It's not a poor company, it's a state-owned company with a lot of assets, and it's benefited from $7 billion in financing from ExIm. That raises a lot of question, certainly in the context in particular of the policies that are implemented against oil and gas company in the US. But more importantly, it's kind of like, why are we subsidizing such a big company abroad, right? Air Emirates is a second top beneficiaries abroad of ExIm financing. Air Emirates is a state-owned company also, and it's a very fast-growing company that when you go on their website, they say that they have the widest and largest number of passengers. They carry the largest number of passengers every year, right? So they're doing very well. 5 of these are like fully state-owned companies. They're all wealthy. Ryanair, is Ryanair on there? Is like the biggest European carrier the biggest European carrier. So state-owned, wealthy, oil and gas, and airlines. This is the thing you need to remember about foreign buyers. And it's got to kind of like, you know, make us wonder why are we doing this, right? These companies are doing perfectly well on top of being subsidized by their own government. What about at home? Well, what these companies do with those cheap loans is that they will go and buy US products. And as I've said, we call it the Boeing Bank for a reason. The top beneficiary in the US of ExIm is the company Boeing, which has a market cap of, depending on the years, of over $90 billion, right? Depending on the years, it benefits the overall activity of 30% to 40% of ExIm activities benefit Boeing, right? And when you look exclusively at loan guaranteed, it's between 60 and 70% of those loan guaranteed go to Boeing. Let's look at the 10 top companies benefiting from Boeing. Benefiting from ExIm. So you have Boeing, GE, Caterpillar. I mean, this is a who's who list of American companies, right? I mean, these are not poor companies, but they are the top beneficiaries. You have a chart that's floating around somewhere that shows you also the share of Boeing assistance versus small businesses. And it is kind of interesting to think about this in this context, considering the rhetoric about ExIm right now and of how it is really essential, and its primary goal is to prop up small businesses, because like the share, even looked in the most favorable way for ExIm, the share going to small business support is 25%, and ExIm in 2014 benefited Boeing, like 40% of the activities benefiting Boeing. You have that chart somewhere. The other big interest, the other big kind of beneficiary of ExIm, which we very rarely talk about, are the lenders. Because half of what the bank does is guaranteed loans that are extended by other banks, by banks, right? So what it does is like basically these lenders, how do they benefit? Well, they go and they extend a loan at almost no risk, because most of the loan is guaranteed by American taxpayers. And it is true that one of the conditions is that the interest rate that they will collect from these loans are lower, but they also collect big fees from the borrowers, right? So this is actually a very sweet deal to be an ExIm lender, because you end up getting to extend big loans, collecting a lot of money on interest, nothing wrong with that. They're lower interest, but then you also make a lot of money with fees. And the best part, again, all the risk has been, most of the risk has been shifted to taxpayers, right? It's also interesting to look at who's benefiting around the world. And you see the same pattern. I mean, like when you look at this country list, you know, especially with the top, it's hard to see that the money is going to countries that are poor, right? Or countries that are excluded from capital markets, right? I don't know whether you're also starting to notice a pattern in all of these charts. I haven't pointed this out, but look, unknown, various company, others, unknown, various country. The data that is made available to the public by ExIm is extremely bad. Their record keeping is very bad and sloppy. And a lot of the entries are actually literally labeled unknown. So there is actually a lot we don't know about where the money is going. And that's more important, I will say, in this list of countries, because there are countries that ExIm is not supposed to do business with, like North Korea, Iran, and now Russia, right? And it's very hard to trust and verify if you actually don't know, what's in this big pile of money, which is quite significant, right? So there's a trend here. This is why we say it's cronyism. It's like it's an agency that gives cheap loans, right, or guarantees cheap loans for wealthy foreign companies to buy product from very wealthy domestic companies with the help of, pretty well-established and wealthy lenders in very wealthy countries, right? So there's definitely a trend. Now, I assume that you guys have you've heard all of these arguments for ExIm. Like the reason why, there's like 5 myths about that we hear. I mean, and by calling them myth, obviously you know where I stand on the issue. But there are 5 things that we hear repeated over and over and over again about why ExIm should be reauthorized, right? The first one is that it promotes export, right? And there's absolutely no doubt that the exporters who are benefiting from the ExIm Bank are liking it. That is not a question. This is why when you probably got the visit of a lot of these exporters who are saying, we love it, it's great, don't take it away, it's awesome. So I'm not at all saying that the people who benefited don't like it. Why wouldn't you like it? You get a cheaper loan, or your customers get a cheaper loan, which allows you to like either sell at higher price, which is what economics tells you often happens. So these guys are benefiting. The question is how much. The question is not so much that some people are benefiting. Some people are benefiting. There's no doubt about that. The question is how much, really, of an impact the Export-Import Bank has, and what would actually happen without it, right? So now let's put it in the scale of how much really, because when you listen to people who are pro-ExIm, you kind of feel that without the Export-Import Bank, our export would literally collapse. It would just it would be a disaster for our export. Well, the reality is like in most years, the U.S. export that are backed by ExIm is less than 2%, right? Last year it was 1.6%, but on average, let's say 2%. So it means that 98% of all U.S. exports are taking place without the help of ExIm, right? Now the question is, what would happen to those 2% of exports? I mean, 2% of export is not negligible. I mean, it's great, right? But the real question is, what would happen to these 2% if ExIm were in there? Would they disappear? Some of it would. But remember who the buyers are, right? Those buyers have access to capital, and I will give you examples, and there's a ton of evidence. And the sellers also are wealthy company. So for the most part, a lot of those 2% will continue to exist. Would these companies get a hit? Absolutely. I mean, it would mean that they would have to do like everyone else, get financing at a higher rate, right? Their profit would get a slight hit. But let's talk about Boeing, for instance. Like, how much of a hit? First, there's been a lot of reports, whether S&P, Finch, GAO, looking at actually what the finances of Boeing would be without the Export-Import Bank. And they all say, it'll be fine. It will be the most affected, but it will be fine. One number to keep in mind is like last year, 10% of Boeing planes were sold with an ExIm guaranteed. again, and they were sold to companies that are state-owned, really wealthy for the most part, right? And so I think it's a fair assumption to make that is backed by the academic literature that looks at export subsidies to say that these export subsidies are actually kind of not effective at propping up exports. And what it does is that it props up some exports, but at the expense of others, right? So the overall, I think we really should worry about the overall effect on export. The second one is it creates jobs. So we hear a lot about this 205,000 jobs that are created by the Export-Import Bank. Again, it is worth putting in perspective in the grand scheme of things, whether when it comes to export jobs or even American jobs in general. And it is really a very small share of job created that are backed by ExIm or supported by ExIm. The same thing should be said about the unlikelihood of all of these jobs disappearing. Would some of these jobs maybe go away? It's possible. I mean, it's possible. All of them, absolutely not. The thing we need also, again, to remember is that this is not happening in a vacuum, right? What the academic literature shows is the way export subsidies and these type of subsidies show is that they actually transfer wealth and economic activity away from unsubsidized job, export, company towards a subsidized one, right? And that's one of the biggest criticism of the claim about job creation that was actually put out by labor economists, but most recently in a report by GAO, where they actually looked at the methodology that is used by ExIm to come up with this 205,000 jobs. And one of the things that they say is that the way they measure the jobs, those job creation, is not taking under consideration the double counting, the nature of the job, whether they're seasonal, temporary, part-time, right? They're counting them as if they're all full-time jobs. And much more importantly, they are counting them as if without ExIm, these jobs wouldn't exist, and without taking under consideration the cost and the loss of jobs in other industries because they're competing with a firm that is getting a cheaper loan, right? So it is always worth, we tend to hear all of the time about the positive aspect of a program, and we very rarely hear about the actual cost of it. And it's for this reason that economists tend to be extremely skeptical of the claim that these kind of export subsidies are net creators of jobs, right? It promotes small business. I've touched a little bit on this, right? So ExIm likes to talk about how almost 90% of its activity are geared towards small businesses. When you actually look at the money, depending on the years, it's roughly 20%. Last year, 25%. It's also worth saying that the way ExIm measured label small business, and it's mostly because of the industries it's dealing with. It's like companies that are not small. I mean, for most of us, I mean, when you ask Americans what small businesses are, because it's up to 1,500 employees and up to 21 million in revenue, which is kind of like, I want to be a small business like that one day. But more importantly, again, when you look at the impact that ExIm has in the world of small businesses in America, it's very small, whether you look at small business exporters or the overall number. Another thing you hear all the time is how ExIm is profitable, right? ExIm, the ExIm Bank is always happy to talk about how it brings money to Treasury. The way it does it is because it collects fees, mostly in order to back these loans. It asks those big companies to pay them large fees. The thing about the profitability of ExIm, I mean, I will say that, by the way, I find it a little odd to be like talking all the time about the profitability of ExIm, considering that in its charter, right, the reason why ExIm supposedly need to exist, it's because without it, there wouldn't be a market. Lenders wouldn't lend money to these companies. But I have to imagine that if the market works, even with distortions and all its imperfection, if there's really a big profit opportunity, they will jump on it. And obviously, the private sector does, right? Because 90% of Boeing planes, and according to GAO, I think it's like 85% of all large body planes for Airbus and Boeings are actually sold without export subsidies. So there is actually a market and that exists. But more importantly, if the Export-Import Bank were actually measuring, right, its profit based on fair value accounting, which is the way the private sector measures its profit, it would actually cost. It would be projected to cost taxpayer money, right? Another thing that is worth mentioning too is we need to remember that there are a lot of government agencies that were showing a profit on paper before they didn't during financial crisis. We have a big exposure with ExIm, and it means that this could happen too, and that ExIm was not always in the black and has been for many years in the red. The other thing I've seen, and I can't say that I know very much about it, but some other people could tell you more about this. I think that when you actually, ExIm is very untransparent, and so it is actually very hard to kind of like figure out what goes and doesn't go into the numbers that they put out. In terms of default rates, they've been massively criticized by the Inspector General and GAO about the way they assess these things. And I think I've heard many times that actually when you actually look at the books, and ExIm doesn't actually look as profitable even today. It's something to keep in mind. That's another one we hear all the time, is like, it is necessary to counter other countries which offer the same type of subsidies. It is true that there are about 60 agencies around the world that offer these type of subsidies. The biggest competitor, obviously, to ExIm is the European version, which spends a great deal of time subsidizing Airbus planes. So the idea is like, if ExIm stops subsidizing foreign buyers, bless you, to buy Boeing planes, well, these companies will go and buy Airbus planes. Well, so there are a lot of problems with that theory, right? So the first one is when you actually look at the way ExIm, it's hard to keep them apart, that ExIm actually, how it justifies its activity, because it has to do this because of OECD agreements. Only 33% of the bank's activities are justified as countervailing foreign subsidies, right? So it means that there's almost 70% of the bank's activity that have nothing to do with countervailing foreign subsidies, right? That I think is a pretty important point. I'd like to point out with this chart another thing that is important. If you look at these two are the justification about lack of capital, whether because of a company doesn't have a good credit score, or there's a political risk or whatever risk in the countries that makes it very hard for the foreign company to have access to credit, right? Well, as you can see here, only 16% of the bank's activities are justified as countervailing capital problems, the existence or the ability to access capital. That's something that is worth remembering, right? When people tell you that without ExIm, companies abroad wouldn't be able to get capital. But more importantly, I'd like to kind of like give you, so let's go back to the foreign competition, right? So very little of ExIm's activity are justified as countervailing those foreign subsidies. The academic literature is actually pretty clear that actually the existence of export subsidies while boosting the output and the GDP in the subsidized activity overall tend to actually have a negative effect on the overall economy. Again, remember, I mean, and this is true for every government programs, right? There's no debating ever the fact that companies that are getting subsidized, actually, there is some debating, but let's say there's no debating about the fact that companies that are getting subsidized, they like it, and very often they get out ahead, right? But the question is it good for the overall economy, right? The most recent paper on this looked at export subsidy with China, right? The Chinese, do the same. They boost their exporters, some industries. And what they find is that the industries that are subsidized get ahead. The overall economy loses by 3% of GDP. It's significant, right? So what it means, and this is a finding that that's come back. I mean, it's a recurring finding. Is that what you end up having with these programs is like basically a transfer of wealth from those that are subsidized, from those that are not subsidized, towards those who are subsidized. Now, I want to give you a concrete example, and there are many across all the industries that are subsidized by ExIm that actually shows that the idea that all that is driving the purchase of a plane is actually the existence of the subsidy. It's some of the data that was put out during the hearing in June that was held by Chairman Henserling, the chairman of the House Financial Services. And I think it's a great example that really illustrates a lot of the kind of the myth in that debate. So the data was provided showing that in 2012, Air Emirates, right, our second biggest beneficiary of ExIm activities, right? Air Emirates, I don't know how you pronounce it. I've heard it pronounced many ways, but just stick with me if I'm not saying it right. So bought 2 Boeing planes in June 2012, bought 2 Boeing planes with ExIm backing, right? That same month, the company bought 4 Airbus planes without any export subsidies, right? So when you look at the terms that the company got, it's pretty sweet. I mean, interest rates, sure, they have to pay big fees, no doubt about it, but it's like really good terms. So you have to put less down in equity for the amount of debt that you take on. The interest rates is almost half what it is that when you get a private financing. But what this example tells you, right, is that first, the company is capable of actually buying planes without these export subsidies, that there are lenders out there, we know it, right? Like some 85% of the planes are sold without those. There are lenders who are willing to sell these planes without export subsidies. And more importantly, for this debate, when it comes to the unilateral disarmament, that actually the existence of an export subsidy is not the dominating factor that drives the decision to buy a plane, right? If Air Emirates went and bought some Airbus planes without the subsidy, it means that it's not the only thing. There's something else that matters in the decision to buy planes. And these examples, we find them recurring over and over again And I think they're important to keep in mind, because you really, when you hear that without ExIm, and in fact, Chairman Hochberg just got interviewed by Kevin Cirilli of The Hill, and he said like literally without ExIm, basically all the Boeing jobs would be shipped overseas, right? It's this idea that foreigners would start only buying Airbus planes. Well, the evidence shows that it's not the case. There's a lot of planes that are bought without subsidies, right? And because lenders are willing to, companies have the money to do it, and this is not the main factor driving the sales. So one of the things that I think we've touched on a little bit about this, but one of the things that is really important to remember when we talk about ExIm is that we tend to overlook the victims of ExIm, right? So you hear it's profitable, it creates 205,000 jobs, it benefits all these companies that are marching on Capitol Hill to say a benefit, this is great, but you actually don't see the people who are being hurt. A study done last year by Dan Atkinson at the Cato Institute, he's a director of trade at Cato. He went and looked at all the industries that we have in the United States, right? And there's about 236, if I remember correctly by memory. And he said, what are the industries that are benefiting directly or indirectly, right? Not just like the air and space industry, but also kind of the supply chain people and all of that stuff. And what are the industries, on the other hand, that are competing with these guys who are benefiting from cheaper financing, right? And what he found is of these 236, and he used, by the way, it's worth saying that Dan was extremely fair in his assessment in that he actually used ExIm's own standards, right, to do his analysis. And he found that 189 industries were directly competing and hence suffering from the competition from ExIm in the United States. So you've heard about Delta, for instance, who's been, complaining for years, and Delta is not alone. It's non-subsidized domestic industries, which is all of them, right? Because there's a gentleman agreement that domestic companies can get a foreign subsidy to buy an Airbus planes. So they buy their planes, like everyone else. If you're in the plane business, I guess and they don't have subsidies. They buy their planes, but then they end up having to compete with all these foreign airlines who actually bought their planes at lower cost, right? They effectively at lower cost. Their financing costs are lower. So again, if you get the Air Emirates example, right? And this is I would recommend that you went and read Richard Henderson, who is the CEO of Delta, but he was also for a long time he was also the chairman of the committee that hosts all of the airlines in the world. So a guy with a lot of knowledge about the airline industry. And one of the things that he writes there is the saving for Air Emirates on those Boeing planes, right, that are backed by an ExIm subsidy, concretely means $20 million per plane, right? $20 million. That's real cash that then can be reinvested in setting new routes in direct competition with domestic airlines. I am a big believer in competition. The more, the better. But not when it's actually unfair, and when you force non-subsidized company to compete with subsidized companies. And it's our government. So Emirates is getting a lot of money from its own government, but that our government give them a leg up, right? And the net assessment as of last year was basically a loss of 7,500 jobs in the domestic airline industry. That's something that you rarely hear about. Let's see. So, but there are other victims of ExIm. So you have all the foreign buyers, right? That's, we may not care as much about, but that's like creating massive distortions in the market. Foreign buyers without subsidies, that's unfair to them. But also, as I said, domestic firms. Consumers are one of the main unseen victims because, as I said, one of the things that happen is like, and the economic literature again shows it pretty effectively, is that goods that are subsidized tend to actually cost more money. Whether they're subsidized, it doesn't matter what kind of form. One of the impact, it's higher prices for consumers. We economists, we hear in this debate about ExIm is all the benefit for producers, right? But we economists care about all producers and also consumers, right? And in the same ways, like, you know, we care about exports, but imports too, right? And consumers are one of the main, one of the unseen victims of the export-import ban. Think about an exporter who is using ExIm, Boeing, ExIm, who is using Boeing planes to export its stuff. I mean, they pay higher prices. ExIm also creates a lot of competition in the domestic market. So one of the things that we have to think about is the impact that it has on capital market, right? So one of the things that export subsidies and subsidies like this, loan guaranteed in government tend to do is that they tend to shift, lenders tend to shift capital away from unsubsidized project towards subsidized project. And you can understand why, right? Because if you're gonna be able to make a lot of money with very little risk, that's a better deal for you. So what it does is like it makes actually access to capital harder for companies that are not subsidized. So it creates actually a problem for domestic companies that are competing to get access to credit. The other thing that we know is that private investors tend to fly to safety. So if they see that there's a company has a loan guaranteed independently of the merits, they tend to actually shift their capital towards that company that's subsidized. That too makes it harder for unsubsidized company to get access to capital. And the final category is obviously taxpayers, right? There's a lot of liabilities, as I said, that we're exposed to. But there's also the fact that basically what this does is lenders facing very little risks, right, have a tendency to be less cautious about who ends up getting the money. And that exposes taxpayers. It's a double whammy for taxpayers. It's like not only are they exposed because concretely they are the ones who are guaranteeing those loans, but on top of that, there is a tendency for the lenders to be less cautious about the type of loan that they extend. I will say that for taxpayers, it's taxpayers and exporters around the countries also. That's one way to think about it, how some domestic companies, domestic exporters, taxpayers are victims of ExIm. This is actually a map that looks at the concentration of ExIm funds, right? Like, as you can see, not everyone is a winner in the, a lot of states are really not in the ExIm business at all. However, every taxpayers and exporters in America are actually responsible for that money that is extended to foreign companies and domestic companies, right? So you have an unfairness where there are states who are massively benefiting from ExIm, but the whole country is really shouldering the burden if things go wrong. You won't be surprised looking at this map to see that Washington State is actually a main beneficiary of ExIm. I have to redo this map to look at, because this is a cumulative number from 2007 to 2013. I'm sure that if I looked at 2014 alone, at the time I didn't have the data yet, but if I looked, I bet you that South Carolina would actually get a fair amount of money, especially if I looked at 1 year alone. So there are a few winners, right? There are a few states who are getting a large amount of the fund, but most, it's important to remember that most states aren't in the ExIm business at all. Finally, I want to draw your attention to something I've talked about. There are a lot of corruption problems and investigations right now going on at ExIm. There's one ExIm official that was just charged and pleaded guilty of accepting bribes, right? So you probably all know about this, and I've heard the arguments that a lot of firms and private firms, it happens too. You have bad apples everywhere. Sure, there's no doubt about this. It happens everywhere. It's more problematic when you actually when this happens with taxpayers' money, but it is true that it happens. What's more problematic is when you actually look at where the money is going to the extent that you can, you actually find a lot of deals that are they're just I just don't know how ExIm can justify it. So for instance, Pemex, right, the biggest beneficiary of the Export-Import Bank, the Mexican state-owned oil and gas. In 2013, they had to go on the record and acknowledge that they were having major corruption issues and major contracting interference with a criminal, with crime organizations. Well, that didn't actually stop ExIm from extending loans in 2014, right? Petrobras, which is the Brazilian state-owned oil and gas company, same thing. It benefited from so Pemex 7 billion, Petrobras is like 300 million. Same thing, major corruption problems and major problems. The Wall Street Journal this week had a piece about how $1 billion in loan were extended to a Russian bank, VEB. I mean, I will spare you my attempt to pronounce the name of that bank, was very strong tied to the main arm dealer in Russia, right? And who became like the chief arm dealer for Syria, right? These are actually problems that we can't overlook for a variety of reasons, right? There are according to the Inspector General, there are 31 cases of investigation for fraud and corruption on the side of the customer of ExIm, with very possible and soon to be indictments. These are real problems which, and again, there's probably more, but I can't really tell you when and I put one of the charts there, when 33% of the foreign buyers, we don't know who they are. We just don't know who they are. So I couldn't tell you whether, in spite of the ban to Russia, VEB is still not getting ExIm loans. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying I could not tell you, right? When a third of the bank's activities and the bank's foreign buyers are unknown and labeled unknown, there's just a lot we can't we cannot verify. The problem is like we know that there's enough corruption and fraud happening in what we know to kind of raise some suspicion about the kind of business that's happening in the unknown section of the bank. And I'm not saying necessarily, I'm not even saying that they're hiding it, right? I think it's like just unbelievably crappy and sloppy record keeping. But if we've been asking for better record, I mean, there are issues with the bank that are also problematic. They removed all their data, their public data, from data.gov in last year in June or July, right? And after they were pressured to put it back, they put it back and they had scrubbed a lot of the field missing. So now primary buyers is not one of the field we have access to. It means that I couldn't tell you, right? That chart, that table, that first table, I couldn't tell you who are the primary primary buyers of ExIm because that field does not exist anymore. And President Hochberg did admit that they did this. He requested these to accommodate exporters who were complaining. I think we should accommodate taxpayers and the public who wants to look at where the money is going. But anyway, so I think what's next for ExIm? Well, it's expiring in June, and there's a lot of discontent. It is as contentious as it's ever been. It is not clear what's going to happen. I think my sense, and I'm not very good at this, so take it with a grain of salt, is that there's a chance that the House will let it expire, but the Senate will introduce a bill. I mean, that's my sense. It's not even clear that the House will let it expire, but that's a much higher probability than it ever was. And it's a shame because all it takes to do the right thing is just to do nothing. Because if they don't do anything, the bank charter will expire. So there are floating ideas about reforms. I think they're all really terrible because this is not the role of the federal government, and there are so many inherently problematic aspects of ExIm, right, that I think these reforms are a bad idea to take place. But more problematically, when you look at bills like the Fisher bill, I mean, these are like just I don't know, they're like, what's the expression, flag waving? I mean, it's just, they're meaningless. They're not going to change anything. It's mostly like write reports, write reports, write reports, and write reports. These are like, requirement of oversight without any tooth, without the ability to inflict any punishment. A lot of these, Diane Katz at the Heritage Foundation went through the Fincher bill and looked at all of its provision and showed that most of them either were already existing requirements that existed in the federal code or demand that were actually put in place in 2012, right? 2012 also is a year that was supposed to bring a lot of reforms to ExIm, right? And it didn't. So I think reforming it is inherently a bad idea. But I hope that if they reform it, what they will do is that they will ban any access to large companies with access to credit, right? That would be an important requirement. I think it's unfair because if companies can't get credit on their own, it probably means they shouldn't, right? But at the very least, you would get rid of the biggest aspect of cronyism, not to mention that it's already in the bank's charter. So I wonder why it's only 16%. Anyway, I'm sorry, I went on way too long. At this point, I just know way too much about that topic, and I could go on for like hours. So if you have questions, please